The other side of the coin on this is programs like DDU GKY and others, which basically offer women the opportunity to, develop skills and migrate to mostly urban areas to take up job opportunities.
Mm.
So, in terms of setting up labor demand in that way, by basically being a matchmaker
Mm.
between, you know, rural women who have a latent demand for labor and corporations or other kind of organizations that have that need. What are your thoughts on the kind of viability of such programs to provide, at a large scale, the kind of labor force participation that women seem to demand in rural areas?
I mean, I think that if you do it carefully and sensitively enough, it can work. I mean, look at Bangladesh. I mean, how did they go from 3% to 36%? It's really a large part of it was textile, and some of it was this Grameen, the self-employment,
Right.
entrepreneurial activity. So between starting small scale businesses at home in the villages and going to towns to work in textile factories, they were able to raise their female labor force participation rates dramatically.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they've solved the problem, but there's been a huge. Of course, they started at a very low base at 3%, so 36. But 36 today sounds like a dream as far as India is concerned,
Yeah.
where we are at 18, 19, right? So I think that it can work, but I think there's a few things that we should be careful about. One is that I think one of the issues that the COVID pandemic has exposed is that when seasonal migrants come from rural areas to the cities, supposing for whatever reason, like this time it was COVID, the
Mhm.
factories had to shut down. What is the fallback? I mean, the only way that workers can survive, if at all, is to trudge all the way back to the rural areas. So rural urban migration is all fine, but I think urban areas need to be made more hospitable for workers, such that temporary ups and downs in the production cycle, for whatever reason, every time it won't be such a big shock as COVID, but there could be, temporary
Yeah.
ups and downs. Some workers can get laid off, factories can slow down, whatever it is. But workers should be cushioned against those shocks. And I understand also that some very small employers would be unable to provide those kinds of cushions because they themselves are struggling. But I
Right.
think this is where the role of governments in terms of keeping the demand side alive, having incomes in people's hands or
Right.
providing low cost housing. I mean, Indian cities are woefully inadequate low cost housing, for the poor. So the only option is slums. And when single girls come, it's hard for them. I mean, they do it, but it's not the best option at all. So I think that if one thinks of it in a holistic way of not just providing them employment, but also housing, some sort of income, support, whether
Right.
it's you think of basic income or whatever it is, one can think about all of these various options.
Yeah.
But I think COVID, I mean, if you have to take any lessons from the COVID pandemic, it is that catastrophe can strike at any moment. They need not be so big, but even small issues. And so, what happens to the workers then?
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. I think that's right.
mm,
Um, yeah, and I think, I mean, the, when we think about programs like this, I think the feasibility to scale, and provide the kind of general opportunities that people need, I think you do need to kind of um, tip the scales a little bit and make this an easy sell, right? And, the way that some of them are designed currently, while they do offer a match, everything else about the situation is troublesome, is fraught. You have to migrate away from the place that you were born and raised, and you don't know anybody in this new location. Maybe you've never been to a big city before in your life. Maybe you've never left your small area around your village.
yeah.
Um, and often you're crammed into a hostel room with 6, 7 other girls, and all of that makes life really, really hard. And as you said, people do it, and that kind of is testament to the idea that, well, social norms can't be that strong that they're preventing women from doing it wholesale, because we see many thousands and tens of thousands of women taking this opportunity up every year. So I think it's an important lesson that, you know, government does have a key role to play in terms of facilitating this kind of private sector entry. Do you think, you know, in your work on gender equity, you know, how much of that kind of extends into the workplace, and what's the role of employers in terms of setting up the right conditions for women to actually stay in their positions? Because obviously labor force participation is not a one-time deal, right? It's a continued effort to make sure that women not only, you know, stay in productive work, but also then are able to rise up the ranks, don't feel like they're discriminated against, etc.
So I think that, as you absolutely rightly say, you know, getting entry is just one part of the problem. Then, you know, whether it is casual sexism, whether it is very not so casual sexism, you know, all of those things happen. Simple things like, you know, just clean toilets at the workplace, you know, things like that. You need to recognize that female workers at the workplace, are welcome, and provisions have to be made to make them feel welcome. You know, so I think that, I mean, the experience varies a lot depending on which sector it is, etc. And one of the things is, because the highly educated women in India are highly educated, and because they also come from, relatively speaking, better off families in terms of class and caste, and they're more aware of laws, etc. So they're also able to, you know, you find, actually, when you look at wage gaps at the high end of the distribution in India, gender gaps are not so high, surprisingly. So in that sense, in terms of wage gaps, you don't see a glass ceiling in India. You actually find higher gender gaps at the bottom end of the distribution, what is called a sticky floor, whereas in the West, it's more a glass ceiling kind of a scenario. And so for all its various many problems, in terms of wage gaps in India, we don't have a glass ceiling. You know, so that's good. That's a good thing. But as you know, women in decision-making positions are few and far between. So whether it is decision-making in the corporate sector in terms of boardrooms, CEOs, you know, top management positions, or it is, of course, government. I mean, it's pitifully low, you know, female representation in top state governments or central government is pitifully low. So as long as women are not part of decisions that impact their lives, there will always be an issue about their needs not being adequately represented, right? And this has nothing to do with an individual bad employer or not. You know, that's not the point. The point is that all the decisions, whether in the private sector or in the public sector, they impact women's lives. But women are not a party to those decisions, right? And everywhere. I mean, even academics is not free from that, you know. So this conversation, fortunately, is now picking up in India about, you know, in academic settings now, if you have an all-male panel, it gets called out, you know, males are not allowed, etc. So somewhere there is a recognition that, I mean, I'm at Ashoka University, which is a new university in India. And in Ashoka, you cannot have any selection committee, no major event where only men get called. It's just not possible, you know. So, you know, there's a very high level of awareness and insistence that that's the way it should be. Our vice chancellor is a woman, etc. But that would not be a typical workplace in India. So the lack of women in decision-making positions everywhere, not just in government, but also in the corporate sector, private sector, that's an issue. That is an issue.
Yeah. So this kind of brings me, you know, now to the sort of framing we started with in the beginning, which is, you know, how do we start to address, coming out of the pandemic, this huge set of questions which existed long before and kind of has its roots, you know, historically. It's been exacerbated by this particular pandemic. Are there ways that, you know, policy or the private sector can capitalize on this moment to create change towards the better?
Well, there'll have to be many different things, and I don't know if I know all the answers to it, but I think there will have to be different initiatives in different spheres. So, for example, one of the things, as you yourself say, it's clear now to everybody that a lot of work gets done at home. That allows the rest of us to go out and work. That's because
Nice to have
somebody else is doing.
personal experience time and
Yeah,
time
and I think
again.
everybody has had that personal experience. So if companies were more sensitive to that need,
Yeah.
and when the next time their female employees say that I need to be home, or insist that their male employees. So I think conversations, or having this sort of policies as far as middle class employees are concerned, which is it's okay to work from home, the work sharing needs to share the load, basically, those kinds of campaigns. So I think that's one conversation to be had. In terms of rural areas, now you see that these frontline health workers, they're extremely poorly paid, and they do very hazardous and risky work. And today, the COVID, would be much worse had it not been for the work of these women. So, for starters, we can increase the salaries or remuneration of
Right.
the paid work that is available in rural India. Create more positions, and so on. So that's that. Then on the farming side, in farming families, when women are working in family enterprises, and if we recognize them as workers, can some I don't know, not a subsidy, but whatever, some financial transfers we made to the family, so that the families feel compelled to say, yes, my wife is working or my daughter is working. So I think that depending on which sector it is, we have to think of different policies. But it's a good time to do that, because a lot of rethinking will happen, as we restructure the ways in which we are working.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. And I think, another potentially positive silver lining coming out of this terrible situation is the idea that, there is an approach or a mindset of all hands on deck right now, that we
Exactly.
need everybody to participate, similar to other crisis situations. You saw the impacts of some of the, temporary rises in female labor force participation after World War II. There's good evidence documenting that actually sort of, made some areas take off in terms of their labor force participation of women, and that persisted for decades afterward. So, hopefully, one thing coming out of this situation is similar, that we just, families need money, and there's a huge chunk of time where they've gotten much less than they probably need, and so now I think it's all hands on deck, and then there's much less of a sort of a barrier to overcome on that front. And hopefully that leads not only to more women in the labor force, but also some kind of persistent effect that sets women on the right paths.
Yeah. And also, actually, in April, which was the strictest month of the lockdown in India, I find that the average hours spent by Indian men on domestic chores went up. Now, I don't know what they were doing, whatever they were doing, but it did go up. So the fact is that I think everybody realized, because April was so locked down, that the domestic helpers also weren't coming,
Right.
to homes to work. And
Right.
Indian middle classes, our lives run on the backs of domestic helpers, basically. And people were proudly posting photographs of them doing domestic chores on social media. And so I think that needle can also shift. I think people are realizing that it's just work. It's not just the woman's work. It's work to be done at home.
Exactly.
And I think that even if it's a slight shift, but if it's done if the shift happens in a sufficient number of families, I think that's the way to shift that norm as well. And I think the beginning can be made in that dimension as well.
That's fascinating. I mean, I like to think of myself as someone who carries the load and helps at home in terms of all those responsibilities. But I noticed it even more during the pandemic. It's true that when you don't have domestic help, when those responsibilities increase, you gotta roll your sleeves up and get to work. And I think some of that sort of sticks, and you realize, hey, this is just regular old work, right?
Yeah.
Well, great. So this is, fascinating conversation, and, a wonderful set of ideas that have come out of this in terms of both reimagining, this puzzle of labor force participation and breaking it down into its various components in terms of measurement, in terms of the supply side, sort of social norms and barriers associated with that, as well as a sort of often neglected demand side. Which potentially is more prone to policy intervention and private sector intervention. So a lot of great ideas that I hope in the coming months as we come out of this pandemic, some of them can actually be put into action. And so we, are relying on leaders like you in India to, put some of that, into the public sphere. Hopefully this initiative can help with that as well. And getting some of the right ideas out there in terms of reframing and rethinking some very core assumptions that we've had. So I think just wanted to say thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your insights, and look forward to continue to hear from you and your leadership.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed chatting with you.